Our scripture this morning comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 3. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land of flowing milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has come now to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to the Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Israel, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is your name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you.
And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So one of the greatest misconceptions about finding your calling in life is that it is attached to something you do over the course of your life. Many people may say, may define their calling professionally. So I found my calling to be a doctor or a social worker or some profession. Others define their calling not professionally, but maybe more relationally. I found my calling to be a mother or grandmother, or perhaps as a member of a particular community. But calling actually doesn't have as much to do with profession or relational identity as you may think. It does. I mean, there's certainly people who find and work out their calling through their professions or through their relationships. Many do, and hopefully we all find that, get a taste of that glory at times in our life. But calling actually has less to do with what you do than who you are. Now, this is perhaps good news for those of us who may be still wondering what we're going to do when we grow up. You know, many people get stressed when we talk about callings, like, well, I'm not in that perfect job or what have you, and like, I must not be following God's calling. You know, this morning is about good news, but it's also about bad news in that sense, because the good news is it's not simply about what you do, it's about who you are. But that is also the bad news. Who are you, anyway? Not you as just kind of your casual self, but I mean your true self. Calling is about living into your true self, not your false self. Who you really are, not who you pretend to be or think somebody else wants you to be and so forth. It's about finding your truest identity and living into that in whatever way you can. So, will your true self please stand up? Yeah, that's the bad news about calling. Vocatio. How do we find it? How do we sense it? How do we then, once we do, live with a growing sense of our truest self? That's really the subject of this morning and the subject of our passage. We are kind of circling back to a passage that we encountered at the very front of our series, only in a little different way. This morning, Moses discovers this burning bush out in the wilderness, and the fascinating thing about this bush is that it's burning, but it's not consumed. The bush just keeps burning, and that's a little different than I'm used to seeing, and then that's where God speaks to him. And in the process, God gives him this calling, and he says, well, let God's people go. And he said, well, in case anybody should ask, could you tell me your name? What's your name? And God answers out of that burning bush, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. That means, I am who I am. What would have been running through Moses' head with that kind of response? I mean, probably running through the Hebrew words for smart aleck or swear words or something. I don't know. It's like, thanks a lot. It doesn't help us actually to know even that Ehyeh asher ehyeh can not only be translated as I am who I am, but also could be translated as I am what I am, or I will be who I will be. Was God just being deliberately vague to Moses? Or was God maybe being extremely, as concrete and specific as God could be in light of a question that Moses didn't know what he was really asking about? You see, in ancient times, a name was more than a name. If you asked for a name, you were receiving more than just simply a group of consonants and vowels strung together. Moses' own name was more than a name. When you may recall the story of him being rescued from the Nile, drawn out by this Pharaoh's daughter, and she then names him Moses and says why she names him Moses. It's because she drew him out of the Nile. We think, what? Well, what's going on there is that the name Moses, or Moshe in Hebrew, sounds a lot like the Hebrew the Hebrew verb for draw out. Moses and draw out sound almost exactly alike. And so she's reflecting an intuition in naming him Moses, that something about his identity, his call, his vocatio, has something will play its way out in life. Something in that action of being rescued, drawn out of the river, will play itself out in ways in his life. Therefore, she names him Moses. And she couldn't possibly have guessed just how right on she was. I mean, here, this child who had been drawn out of the river would eventually draw out his people, rescue his own people from slavery in Egypt, even drawing them out through the dangerous waters of the Red Sea into freedom. I mean, Moses lived into not only his name, but his identity signaled in the name. So when Moses asks God, "What's your name?" he's really asking, who are you? I mean, who are you for real? Like, what are you all about? What is your identity and purpose? Who are you? One of the greatest mystics and spiritual seekers of the last 2,000 years was a monk whose name we don't know, who lived in the 6th century, but who wrote under the pseudonym of Dionysius the Areopagite. He wrote this incredible book called The Cloud of Unknowing, which almost gives surgical precision to following the spiritual path. And one of the things he observes in his book is that God can certainly be loved, but not thought. God can be taken and held by love, but not by thought. In other words, you can't just heap on a bunch of words to describe who God is. You can write book after book. You can stack them in library after library, and none of those libraries will tell you as much about God as you'll learn and get to know through loving God and through that kind of attachment. It will also take you deeper into the mystery when you fall in love with God than those books will. But it will also take you into a deeper form of knowing. When Moses asked God then for that thought stuff, tell me your name, give me some words here, God doesn't answer him in the way he expects, doesn't really answer his question at all. I am who I am. I will be who I will be. I am what I am. But instead, God does reveal God's self most centrally to Moses through showing Moses where God is. Not what God is, but where God is. Namely, God is in the burning bush. Now, this image serves as more than simply some sort of anecdote about what happened 2,000 years ago. This idea of God appearing in a burning bush that was not consumed taps deeply into the mythological imagination of the ancients. It's their way of trying to actually speak to you and I and people who would follow after them about how we find God over and over again, not just simply thousands of years ago, but actually how we encounter God. It serves as a metaphor, a symbol, trying to speak to us about where God is. Where is God according to this metaphor? Well, fire in the Bible consistently appears as a symbol for passion and love coming together. Passion and love. And the fact that this bush is not consumed by this fire, this passion and love, signals that where God is found is where you find this passion and love coming together in a way that does not consume its bearer. Do you know people, for instance, who absolutely love whatever they're doing or how they're being in the world? They're full of energy, and they can do whatever they're doing, and it just doesn't seem to exhaust them. It actually seems to give them energy. We found in your own life times, maybe not always, but certain steps you've made in the world, maybe for just a short time, but where you actually experience that, where like you could be doing this or being this way for hours and hours and hours, and you maybe lose track of time, when you're doing it. And maybe day after day you're doing this, and you just, you get tired, but not like tired, not like exhausted. Those things that you're doing produce this wholeheartedness that gives you energy. Well, if this story is right, this is where you find God. This is where you encounter God in a way that connects you in love, not just simply a bunch of words. This is the way God speaks to you, not with words, by thought, but through love. God appears to you and I in burning bushes just as much as God appeared to Moses and the ancients this way. And so when you experience this, it is a way you want to pay attention. And when you see others experiencing it, you can also kind of hear God's voice just simply through being in proximity to people who are fully alive like this in the world, experiencing that fire. Hopefully we all find periods like that. We all also find that they don't always last, do they? We can be so charged up, and maybe we're in an occupation, or maybe we're in a relationship, or whatever it is that for years and years may give us that kind of energy, but then for whatever reason that fire dims. It starts to actually consume us. We start becoming exhausted, and we wonder, well, wait a minute, this used to give me such love and fire and passion and energy, and now it's just not working. We find ourselves a bit lost in the world, wondering what's gone wrong. Well, the title of this reflection this morning was The Call to Get Lost. Suggestion that it's actually those times when we feel lost like this that can be incredibly productive, not disturbing. Well, they can be disturbing, but they can also be productive. I mean, most of us, when we think about being lost, a lot of us, as Rebecca kind of drew out of us, we have these memories of being lost, maybe as a young child, and that's a terrifying experience. Some of us can speak even more than just as young children about the experience of being lost. We can experience being lost as an adult, both physically and spiritually, mentally, what have you. It can be terrifying. And sometimes we get lost like this, we get off of our path, our vocatio, our calling, due to our own fault. Frankly, we're broken, we're imperfect. We stray from our path. Maybe we weren't paying close enough attention. Or maybe something about that sense of the burning bush spooked us. It delighted us, but also frightened us. It felt like a compliment we didn't deserve, maybe. Or we realized how many changes it would take to actually adjust our lives to follow that burning bush. And we thought, I don't know. And then we kind of go on a different path, and after a while we kind of wonder, well, why am I so exhausted? So sometimes we're off the path and it's our own doing, but sometimes we can be a bit lost, even deeply lost, not because of what we've failed to do, but because of what the Spirit is trying to do for us and in us. Meaning, there are times in our path where the path is going to take a turn. We've been used to following in a certain direction. It's going to take a turn. And unless that fire kind of starts to dim a bit, starts to burn a little bit less brightly and slow us down, we might just go stomping straight ahead and miss the turn we're supposed to take. And so that fire dims. We feel lost, and we do what? Well, some of us, when we feel lost, we start to run and panic, but that's not what we're called to do when we're called to be lost. No, what we're called to do is something that David Wagner advises in his poem Lost, which some of you have heard. I'll repeat for those of you not unfamiliar with it. He says, he talks about being lost in the woods, but he's really talking about being lost in life. He says, when you're lost, stand still. Don't run, don't panic. Stand still. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen, listen. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. Sometimes when we're lost, it's because we're responding to a call, not because we've strayed from it. We're called to stand still. Don't panic. Trust that God loves you and is as willing to be present for you now as ever before. Listen. Look around. And don't move until you sense the fire again. That sense of burning bush. It may not be revealing to you your whole next life, your whole process that you're supposed to do for the rest of your life. It's just going to reveal maybe your next step beyond being lost. And so it goes in our lives. We never have a complete sense of our true self or what we're supposed to be up to in the world. We just have burning bush by burning bush, dimming bush and burning bush, dimming bush and burning bush. And by following those moments, we make our way through. And we live our lives according to our fullest expression of ourselves, not the lowest expression. Well, one of the people who's a great example of doing this comes from Countryside Church itself. Those of you who've been around for a long time may recall a little blonde-haired kid years ago who grew up and did well for himself. His name is Clayton Chapman, one of many who have done such a thing. Clayton and the Chapman family have been longtime members here, and now Clayton is most widely known as the owner of the Gray Plume restaurant in Midtown. And the Gray Plume, if you were to look at Clayton's life, the Gray Plume has won all kinds of awards now. I think it's been up for the James Beard Award for Best Restaurant in the Midwest multiple times. Clayton himself has been nominated multiple times for James Beard's Best Chef, Rising Star Best Chef. His career has just really taken off. But if you were to look, and if you were going to start now and say, oh, wow, that's pretty impressive, and then look back over the course of Clayton's journey, it would look actually like this nice, smooth ride, this gentle trail from success to success to success. It would start out perhaps at the age 15 looking at Mother's Good Food restaurant when he was a dishwasher, and then discovering that he loved to work with his hands and loved to be in the restaurant field, and then moving on to the M's Pub in the Old Market and doing wonderfully well there, and then he going off to culinary school in Chicago, and then there in Chicago studying under a couple of the grand master chefs of Chicago, Rick Tormonto and Laurent Gross, and then studying under them, and then going off to Europe to learn French culinary arts in France, and then coming back and becoming the youngest executive chef in the United States at V. Mertz downtown, and then later at Spencer's Steakhouse. And finally winding up as the chef and owner of this incredible Gray Plume. Wow, what a ride. Wouldn't it be great to be him? And yet, if you were to back up and examine more closely any point in Clayton's journey and look forward, try to peer into the future from that point, the future will actually look pretty wide open, pretty hard to figure out, sometimes black as night. No, at no point in Clayton's journey did it all just seem like, oh, here's the path I'm on. But there's struggle involved. There was soul searching and deep standing still. As the worship team talked with Clayton last week in preparation for this service, Clayton really, I think, summarized the way he moves through life in a metaphor. Clayton was talking about something that he does daily. He wasn't talking about a metaphor. He was talking very concretely something he does, but I took it as a metaphor. And I don't know whether Clayton would take this as a metaphor for his life or not, but perhaps you'll hear in this story a metaphor for your own life. Clayton spoke of this almost daily practice of menu writing. He said, most of our menus are written 3 times. 3 times. And we're like, what? 3 times? Yeah, the reason for this is because Clayton's restaurant specializes in ultra-fresh ingredients that are sourced locally and sustainable practices. In fact, his restaurant was one of the most greenest restaurants in the United States. But really ultra-fresh, beautiful ingredients that he develops relationships with local farmers and ranchers, gets to know them, gets to know what's in their fields and on their farms and so forth. And so he starts then to write a menu. It has to be seasonal. You're not going to have a lot of lettuce and things in the dead of winter. And so it's all responding to the changes of season. And so he starts out with one version, the one that you just write because you're planning and you're aware of those seasons. But then that menu that you're planning for a particular day of week, and his menu changes almost daily because of this commitment to fresh. The menu has to change in light of what the farmer or rancher says they're actually bringing. So you plan on this, but there's going to be some changes because in the end, this is what we're going to be bringing today. And then that menu, often the day of, has to be rewritten based on what actually arrives at their door. In other words, some days the farmer even says, I'm bringing you beets, but there are no beets, there are carrots. Or I'm bringing you string beans, but what actually arrives are an abundance of scallions. Well, what do? you're writing the menu. You're rewriting the menu for that evening or for the next day. So, what they find themselves having to do then is both Clayton and his crew basically have to do what David Wagner suggests when we're lost. Don't panic. Stand still. Stand still and listen. What's come in? What are the flavor profiles of those ingredients? What are the fragrances? What are the textures? And what do we have on hand? What are their flavor profiles, textures, and fragrances? And you listen. You spend time with these ingredients until they begin to tell you a story or sing a song. You wait till the connections are made and the fire begins again. You find the burning bush within those ingredients, and there it is. There's dinner tonight. And through this practice, Clayton has not simply become one of the premier chefs in the United States, but through this practice applied not only to culinary arts, but to the practice of living, where you make plans, you experience adjustments to those plans, and then you may have to adjust again in light of present reality. Clayton Chapman has come to be more his true self, operated from that standpoint of being his truest self. One might even suggest that this is the very practice that puts Clayton in the best hearing proximity of the voice of God. Last week, Richard Rohr, in one of his daily meditational writings, Richard being a Franciscan monk, wrote the following words: "I am who I am in the eyes of God, nothing more and nothing less. I am who I am in the eyes of God, nothing more, nothing less." I love the twist that puts on our passage, where God says, "I am who I am," or "I am what I am. I am what I will be, what I will be." Suggests that maybe that's not just God's identity that's like that, but ours. That just as God is not defined simply by what God does, but who God is, so are we. So are we. So by finding that path, that three-menu approach to life, planning, responding again, and learning to listen when you're lost, and refusing to go forward until that burning bush appears once again, Clayton Chapman has not simply lived into a vocatio or calling to be a world-class chef, but Clayton Chapman is living into his true calling. His true calling being to be Clayton Chapman. In being Clayton Chapman, Clayton has discovered the soul of his work in the work of his soul, and the work of his soul in the soul of his work. Amen.